Yo soy tú mismo, un canal para la liberación interior. Yo soy tú mismo, escuela de sabiduría de la no dualidad. Tiene como propósito contribuir a facilitar el camino a la autorrealización. Si tuvieras un sincero interés en llegar a aplicar estas enseñanzas en tu vida cotidiana para trascender el sufrimiento que impone el falso ego, puedes contactarnos en la siguiente dirección de email: yosoytumismocanal @gmail.com.
Okay. Buenos días a todos. Hoy estamos en Yo soy tú mismo, en nuestra serie de entrevistas que estamos haciendo con maestros y comunicadores espirituales, y hoy tenemos el placer de contar con David Goldman, que David Goldman es un inglés, nació en Inglaterra y es el biógrafo ha sido el biógrafo autorizado oficial de maestros espirituales como Ramana Maharshi, Lakshmana Swami o Papaji. Ha escrito varios libros sobre las enseñanzas. El más famoso es Sé lo que eres, basado en las enseñanzas de Ramana Maharshi, y vive ahora en la India. Se mudó allí en los años 70 y ha estado también con maestros espirituales de la talla de Nisargadatta Maharaj y otros también que en Mumbai, y aparte también tiene una serie de vídeos en internet sobre las enseñanzas, los devotos, los seguidores de Ramana Maharshi, que de aproximadamente muchas horas de duración. Nosotros pondremos el enlace en la página web para llevar al que quiera profundizar en todo esto y que pueda saber más, ¿no?, de las enseñanzas del gran sabio Ramana Maharshi, ¿no? Hi, David.
Hi.
It's a pleasure to have you here, to have you on our channel, because there are many people who want to know about the Ramana Maharshi, and they don't know where to start from. They don't know what books to read. They get misleading information.
But there is a translation of "Be as you are" in Spanish. I wrote "Be as you are" in the mid-1980s, primarily for people who knew nothing about Hinduism, who knew nothing about Ramana Maharshi, but had an interest in finding out. Up till that point, most books about Ramana tended to assume that you knew something about Hinduism or knew about the tradition, so they were very confusing. So I wrote that book primarily for people who started from nothing. So every time a new term or a new idea came up, I explained what it was. So it was very much developed incrementally with everything explained. And there is now a Spanish version of that translated by a friend of mine, Eduardo Linda. He's a Mexican devotee. I think it's published in Spain. If people want a good place to start, that's an excellent introduction. But for people who want a good general overview, but who haven't had much exposure up till the present moment.
And is there any book that Ramana reviewed himself that you can say that these are his words and there is no taken or interpreted by somebody else, but he reviewed them and he put his sign there?
Be As You Are is a collection of dialogues arranged by topic from books, some of which were published during his lifetime, which he did edit and approve. So to some extent, a lot of the words in Be As You Are were approved by him, but there isn't, so far as I know, a Spanish book of dialogues or writings by him, every single word of which was edited and approved by him. That doesn't exist as yet.
Yeah. So would you recommend the Be As You Are to start?
I would recommend it because it's a very good place for people who know little or nothing, but who have a keen interest in finding out more. Everything is explained page by page, topic by topic. Also, the subjects are arranged and classified in an order which Bhagavan himself said was the most important. So that the most important stuff is chapter 1, not so important chapter 2. Mm-hmm. So within each topic, things are arranged in order of importance. So you get a good idea of what he considered to be important and what the main points of his message were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because Ramana Maharshi was famous because he advocated the self-inquiry question or the technique, but it's not the only thing that he handed to people that came there.
He wasn't proactive. Do you know what I mean by proactive?
Yeah.
He didn't tell people who came what they should or shouldn't do. Mm-hmm. So if you came to see him with some background in a particular tradition, some practice, he wouldn't tell you to stop it and do self-inquiry. He would say, very good, carry on. He didn't really care what you did so long as you cared about it. But if you asked him a direct question, what is the quickest and most direct way to get enlightened? Then almost invariably he would say self-inquiry, and he might tell you how to do it, but he would never impose it on people. So although it's in a way his most distinctive verbal teaching, it wasn't something that he expected everyone to do, and he didn't really mind if you weren't interested.
Yeah, so he wasn't prescriptive about it.
Correct.
He was open to different. Maybe if somebody was lost or didn't know what sadhana wasn't clear about what sadhana take or follow, maybe he would. Yeah, that's what you mean.
He wasn't that keen on talking at the best of times. He liked being quiet, and he said if you came and sat with him in silence, then there was a possibility that through a kind of spiritual osmosis, then you would get some taste of his state simply by being quiet in his presence. So he said that was the most direct and the most immediate transmission that he had available. And all the questions and answers that you read in the books are from people who, for one reason or another, were not tuning into this primordial silence, if you like, and who needed some kind of verbal or philosophical framework in which to make better sense of the world they lived in, and in order to have some articulation of a path that they could follow to reach a particular goal. Mm-hmm. So his primary message, if you like, was the silence that people felt in his presence. But if people couldn't tune into that, if they couldn't benefit from it, then he was happy to talk about philosophy, anything you liked. Mm-hmm. But if you put him on the spot and said, what's the quickest way to reach this state? He would always say self-inquiry.
Mm-hmm. So let's focus a little bit on this self-inquiry. And just to, for the people who don't know what the self-inquiry is, or Atma-vichara, could you explain briefly how it is done
briefly
in a nutshell?
Do we have 5 minutes, 10 minutes?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So the basic premise that Bhagavan is hanging all these teachings on is that your individual sense of I, your feeling of being a person inside a body, is sustained by the habit of this thing that you call I inside yourself, connecting and associating with thoughts, ideas, memories, perceptions, and so on. He said your idea that you occupy a body with something called I can only exist so long as that thing called I is associating with a perception or a thought. I see a tree, I am angry, I remember my grandmother. So I is the subject inside yourself, and you perpetually locate it inside yourself by reaching out to things which you think are outside of yourself and saying, I experience this, I perceive this, I think this, and so on. So what Bhagavan is saying is that if you can sever all the connections that this internal I makes with the objects of perception, the things that it thinks about, the memories, the ideas, this individual I has no capacity to exist and persist by itself. He said this is the important thing to note. It only appears to exist when it's joined to something else. So if you can sever all those connections between this I, which connects with things outside of itself, and then remains purely as a feeling or a sensation of I inside yourself, then it can no longer continue to convince you that you are this person inside this body. It subsides back into its source and it disappears, and then you discover who you really are. What Bhagavan is saying is that your individual I covers up awareness or knowledge of your true state, and it continues to cover it up by continually associating with things it imagines are outside of itself and experiencing them. So what he is suggesting as a practice is that you look at the I, which is the subject, instead of letting the I latch onto objects outside of yourself or in your head. Just be continuously aware of I as subject, and to reject all of the mind's attempts to put attention on things which are not this I. He said if you can do this vigilantly, attentively, sooner or later this I has to subside back into its source and disappear, and at that point you find out who you really are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very well put. So it's basically removing the connections that attach the I to the...
He says that this sense of I can only exist if it's thinking about something, remembering something,
linked to a different thing, to another thing.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So as a practice, he said, just look at what's going on inside your head right now, and you'll notice that you're looking at something, you're thinking of something, you're remembering something. And he said, as that happens, look at yourself to establish this relationship. There is an I, which is thinking, which is seeing, and there is an object which is registered as an object of the subject I. So he's saying, instead of looking at this thing as an object, be aware of yourself, the thinker, the perceiver, as subject. He said, just keep hold of that subject as subject, and don't let that subject try to reach out and connect with anything else. Mm-hmm. It's very hard, it's very difficult, because it's the nature of the mind to reach out and grasp and experience things, because only by doing this can it continue to exist. So its natural default program is connection, connectivity, reaching out, grabbing and experiencing. So it's a massive effort of reconditioning to say no, 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 every time the mind wants to reach out, and instead looking back inside yourself to this I, which is doing the thinking, the remembering, the perceiving, and holding on to that alone. But if you can succeed in doing that, if you can stop the external, the extroversion of the mind, and just be aware of mind as I, then this mind has to disappear.
Yeah. And we've been basically doing the opposite during our lives, you know?
It's the
extroverting the mind,
to extrovert itself, to look at things in the world, to want them, to desire them, to experience them, to choose between them. All of these things have a common thread. There is an I who chooses, an I who decides, an I who judges, an I who wants, an I who remembers. Bhagavan said this is like a thread on a necklace. Everything that you do, everything that you think, there is a common subject who is coordinating this and taking a position inside yourself. I am doing this, I am thinking this. And he said, by putting attention on this thing inside yourself, which imagines it's in control, which is doing the choosing, which is doing the deciding, and discarding thoughts of all the things it wants to play with and enjoy, then sooner or later it has to disappear.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of an inherent property of the mind, the extroversion, reaching out to objects.
Mind itself only exists because an I has projected something in front of itself which it wants to see and enjoy. This is, in a way, very fundamental to Bhagavan's worldview. He says that if you see anything in front of you, then the I which is seeing it has actually created that which is in front. So he says you create this world in front of you in order to enjoy it, to experience it, and this perpetuates your sense of being an individual person. You need to have this projection in order to validate your self-existence as an individual person. So the whole function and process of mind is to create a reality in front of you that you can experience and enjoy. And he said the way out of this, the exit door, if you like, is to stop putting attention on the external projections and instead look at this thing inside yourself that wants to experience, that wants to enjoy, that is noticing all these things.
Mm-hmm. And that's what he means when he, or for example, one of his devotees, Robert Adams, say that the world is an emanation of your own mind. That's what they mean.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, when Ramana or Robert Adams also say that the world is an emanation of your own mind.
Correct. Yes, yeah.
That. Mm-hmm.
So he said everything, so long as you think you're a person inside a body, everything that you see, which you take to be outside of yourself, is a mental creation. You have projected and superimposed a false appearance on that which is really there. By having a dichotomy between an internal observer and an external world, you have created a layer of false appearance, and you have created it for the sole purpose of enjoying your desires and validating yourself as an individual inside a body. He said the way out of that is to challenge this whole process of subject-object experiencing, to go back to the subject, to be aware wholly of subject, to discard, cease to pay attention to objects until subject alone remains. And then this I inside yourself, which only existed by association, has to subside and go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when we hear things like the world is an illusion, the world doesn't exist, is that the superimposition that the mind makes onto the world, onto reality?
When Bhagavan is saying the world is not real, mm-hmm. He's saying that the things that you perceive don't have any permanent abiding reality. They're just appearances that come and go, and that you yourself have caused an appearance to come into existence and superimpose itself on what is truly there. Mm-hmm. He said you've made a false world for yourself in much the same way as the dreamer creates an internal dream world, something that's created out of nothing in the interior brain space, if you like. He said in the same way, the waking state is a projection of thoughts, desires. You create an unreal universe for yourself with yourself, your I, as the central coordinating enjoyer. Mm-hmm. And that particular external reality or that external appearance will continue to persist until you challenge and eliminate the one who projects it.
Mm-hmm, right. And the one more question about self-inquiry. Do you think it's something that reserved to those who are mature enough, who are capable of maintaining the attention constantly on the self long enough, or anybody can start the practice?
There is no record of anybody asking Bhagavan if they could do it and being told they weren't ready, they weren't mature. There are 2 or 3 recorded instances in which he wrote or said that self-inquiry was for mature people, but he never defined maturity. Mm-hmm. And in practical terms, from what I've read of everything he said, if you wanted to do it, if you had a passion or an interest in doing it, then that qualified you to do it. So the level of maturity you need to do it is simply an aspiration to succeed. If you want to do it, if you have the time and the inclination to do it, then you're qualified to do it.
Yeah, because if you just you're able to do it just like 4 or 5 times a day. I mean, if it's self-inquiry is based on the fact that it's on the erosion, constant looking at the I that doesn't exist. If you're not persistent enough.
Exactly. Bhagavan never said that it was a practice that should be limited to fixed times of the day, sitting down with your eyes closed. He told Paul Brunton in the 1930s that sitting meditation was for the merest of spiritual novices. I think ideally he wanted people to incorporate it into their daily life, to have this challenging going on. He wanted them to have a background awareness that an I subject was engaging with objects, and to constantly transfer attention from the things that were being looked at to the one who was doing the looking. Mm-hmm. So he never encouraged anyone to give up their job, abandon family responsibilities. He said, if you have a job that requires your intellect, then go to work, do it with full attention. But he said, everybody wastes time. He said, in everybody's life, you spend hours daydreaming, wasting your mental energy. When your family doesn't need you, when your job doesn't need you, that's the time to look inside yourself, see what's going on, and gain control over all this mental activity, which is causing you to have all the wrong beliefs you have about yourself and the world. He said, don't come to me and complain you're too busy, you've got time in the bathroom, you walk to work, you go shopping. He said, get to work on your mind in all the spare time you have. And if you succeed in doing that, you will create a zone of silence inside yourself. And that when you do have to use your mind with your family at work, then you start functioning from that zone of silence that you've created in your spare time.
There are no excuses.
No excuses. He said, nobody is too busy. Everybody has some spare time to do this.
Yeah. And a friend of ours asked if, are you familiar with the teachings of Douglas Harding?
I know a little bit, yes.
Yeah, do you know them? And well, he told us to ask you if the 180-degree turn, you know, with his finger, you know, that kind of experiment that he developed is the same as Atma Vichara. It has the same essential basis that Atma Vichara has.
I think Douglas Harding had a spontaneous awakening. The idea that he didn't have a head was something that he experienced directly, experientially. And I think a lot of his teachings evolved in a way that he was trying to produce little gadgets or mechanisms or tricks so that people could come to that same discovery that they didn't have a head. It was quite eccentric in a way. He did like Bhagavan. He came here in the 1960s. He came to Tiruvannamalai. He had an affinity with Bhagavan, but I don't think that what he was saying was the same as self-inquiry. The goal, of course, was the same. He was trying to show people that there wasn't an individual person inside a body, but the ways that he was attempting to teach it or demonstrate it were not classic inquiry in the way that Bhagavan would understand it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and the goal would be the same, but not the...
Yeah. Right.
Exactly. Not the way.
He was an entertaining, engaging man who had all kinds of tricks, stories, gadgets to get you back to the self, but I don't think he ever advocated classic inquiry in the way that Bhagavan did.
Yeah. What about the surrender, the letting go? Because that's or the...
Bhagavan always said there are only two effective methods to realize the self, self-inquiry or unconditional surrender. He didn't say that one was better than the other. He said they both will work, and he did say that other methods don't. So those were the two methods that he endorsed. He never discouraged anyone from practicing either, and he never gave superiority to one or the other.
Yeah. And I saw in one of your videos that you get many complaints from people that practice Atma Vichara and say that it doesn't deliver any results. Is it because they give up prematurely? Is it because they don't? It's not their way of.
It's not a practice that produces obvious results, except possibly at the beginning. I think everybody who starts a spiritual path, they get very peaceful, blissful. They have good experiences at the beginning, and then they wear off a bit later. And that there's something about inquiry that, how shall we say, it tends to get a little bit boring. People tell me, oh, I ask myself, who am I? and there's nothing there. It's just a blank. Nothing ever seems to happen. I think the problem is not the method. It's a crisis of expectations.
Mm-hmm.
I think people want tangible, perceivable results, and that's not the point of inquiry. You're not aiming to get something as an experience that validates your method or the amount of time you're putting in.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you about the devotees, Ramana's devotees. Do you have any? What's your most fascinating or astounding story, or the story that touches you the most when it comes to the devotion, the trust they had, you know, the way they found him?
So many. To tell one story is to somehow diminish all the others.
Yeah.
There are so many people who came with outstanding levels of love, devotion, people who didn't have any interest in self-inquiry, but they came, they surrendered, and through their unconditional love towards Bhagavan, they eliminated their own sense of individuality.
Some of them stayed, some of them left.
Many people had jobs. Many people would come, stay for a few days, go back to their town. Bhagavan never let anybody stay permanently around him who had responsibilities somewhere else. So if he found out that you'd left your wife at home, or you weren't supporting your family properly, you didn't get to stay very long, he'd send you back home to look after your family. He didn't believe in dropping out of society in order to attain spiritual goals if you left somebody behind who was dependent on you. There was a friend of his, friend in the sense of they were at school together, and this friend of his had unfortunate circumstances. He was unemployed, he had a lot of children, most of them were daughters, which is not so good in India. You have to pay a fortune to get them married off. So he wanted to give all that up and become a sannyasin, and Bhagavan said, no, that's not the way. And he said it's far easier to realize the self as a householder than as a sannyasin. So he quite clearly said, don't give up whatever destined circumstances you have in your life. Running away from them is not going to work.
What about Ramana's daily life? What was a normal day like at the ashram? What did he do?
That varied according to which era his life was on. In the early days, it was probably just him and his attendant, Palaniswami. He said so few people were coming, so few people were interested. Often they would lock the door of Virupaksha cave, and they might wander on the hill for 2 or 3 days and nobody even noticed they weren't home. But those were early days before he got very famous. As the years progressed, he got more and more imprisoned, if you like, by ashram routine. It wasn't something he liked or enjoyed, but I think he recognized at some point that there was a magnetic attraction.
Yeah.
People were going to come, and that he couldn't run away from the responsibility of being in one place and being available. But I think by the 1940s, he somehow regarded himself as a prisoner who had to sit behind bars and have people stare at him through the bars.
And I have another question here about let me see. How many of the devotees have you known personally?
Quite a lot. When I showed up at Ramanashram in 1976, Bhagavan had only been dead, 26 years? So I would say that of the people who lived in Ramanashram at that time, maybe a quarter had some kind of personal contact with Bhagavan. At that point, they were in their 50s, 60s, 70s. So I know or knew many of the people who appear in the books, because they'd probably gone back in the 1950s and then come back to Ramanashram in the 60s and 70s. So most of the people who are well known through the books, I had some personal contact with.
And why did you then, you went to Mumbai to be with Nisargadatta Maharaj too, right? You were, how long were you there?
I went there in 1978 and made regular visits for the next 2 years, but he had a very small room and he didn't let people stay for very long because lots of people wanted to come and nobody wanted to leave. Hotel California. So he had a rule that after you've been there 2 weeks, you had to go away, but then you could come back after another 3 months. So he kept tabs on all the people coming and going, and if he thought you'd extended your stay too long, he'd drop a hint and tell you to leave. But if he asked you to leave, you could just go away for some time and come back later.
What made you go there? Did you feel the need of being with someone who was alive, or?
I was staying at Ramanashram. I had read I Am That. Initially I didn't like it that much, but the more I read, the more it sucked me in. And then I started seeing people come back from Mumbai. My friends had been there. And when they came back, they were absolutely glowing. They were absolutely radiant. It wasn't that they had to convince me that this man had a good teaching or a good practice or a good anything. There was something about the state of these people after they'd been and sat with him for a week that convinced me this was a place I needed to go.
Did you notice that if people who attended the satsangs, not only with Nisargadatta but also with Papaji, if they experienced a change, like prior to meeting Papaji or Nisargadatta, they had a conceptual understanding, and once they got there, they suddenly became aware that they were only, what they knew was only conceptual. They experienced a real understanding just by being in the presence.
Many times in both places. Maharaj was very good at getting you to, he called it getting the knowledge. Getting the knowledge wasn't enlightenment. It was a kind of being aware of yourself as being and not identifying with all the ideas and concepts that you might previously have held about yourself. It was just coming to rest in an underlying state of beingness, knowing that to be the source of all your other concepts, the source of your identifications. So that was his method, his technique, if you like. Papaji was a bit more, not direct, what's the word? He had a capacity to show people briefly who they really were, to put them in contact with the self, to stop the individual I from functioning so completely that for a short duration of time, you actually felt yourself to be self. And if you stood up and started talking in that state, Papaji used to encourage people to stand up and talk about what had happened to them. These people were just talking like the Upanishads. They were talking like great sages with great Advaitic experiences. He had this capacity to somehow extract this individual I from your consciousness, to show you what consciousness was. It wasn't permanent in the vast majority of cases. It was temporary, but in that moment there was a genuine waking up to what was real, to what was true. It might only be temporary, but you could just see from people's faces it was a wow moment. They suddenly knew what truth was, what reality was. And I talked to Papaji about this, and he said enlightenment is a very good word, because when I see this happen to somebody in front of me, at a subtle level, I actually see streams of light coming out the top of their head. So he said it's a nice coincidence of terminology. He said you can't fake that. When you get that moment of relinquishing your individual I, there's like a little firework display on the top of your head that I can look at and know that you've got rid of your eye and you've been illumined and lit up in some way.
Mm-hmm. Did it happen to you too, when you first got there?
I got incredibly quiet, peaceful, very well grounded in a sense of what I was and who I was, sitting with him, a knowledge that anything I said was peripheral, inconsequential, compared to this vast sort of oceanic experience he was kind of almost forcing on you in a way.
Yeah, I read that part in the, I think it was a video too, when you say that when you were with Lakshmani Swami, I think, possibly?
Lakshmana Swami, yeah.
Yeah, when you were, that you felt that you were like very ahead in the spiritual journey. You were, and then when you was with him, you realized that you only went a short distance and there was a lot still to cover.
Right. There's something about being in the proximity of a jnani who has the capacity to transmit a knowledge or awareness of the self that, first of all, it cuts off your mental flow almost immediately. It's effortless, but at the same time, it puts you in a place where you understand that your own personal efforts up to that moment have been very inconsequential, that you haven't really accomplished much, and that there are so many further, deeper, more expansive states that you have to go through before you can finally rest in the self. So having had this experience with Maharaj, with Lakshmana Swami, with Papaji, I came to understand that the best and most efficient way, if you like, of reaching this state was to find somebody in this state and spend as much time as possible sitting with them.
Yeah. Is there any master, current master that you would say?
I get asked this question about 3 times a week by email, and
I can imagine.
There's nobody I recommend. In fact, if there was somebody I recommended, I would probably be sitting there myself. So if you find me sitting in my house in Tiruvannamalai, it means nobody's convinced me. If you find me somewhere else, it means, okay, I've been convinced.
Yeah, because if we speak of numbers, I think I heard you in another interview that it's very disheartening to hear how many people might be. Only Ramana himself, he said that he said that there were only two beings enlightened. One was his mother and the cow.
This is not quite true. Bhagavan only gave public certifications to his mother and Lakshmi the cow. It doesn't mean that he didn't accept that it had happened to other people. I think he didn't really want to endorse anybody who was still alive. I think he accepted and appreciated that some people had come there, had had a direct experience of the self, and I don't think he wanted them burdened with public knowledge of who they were, because he recognized it was nice to be private in this state and not be mobbed by other people. So I think there was a recognition of other people, but he didn't want to burden them with a certification saying you're enlightened, because everybody else would start running around after them.
One thing about the devotion, another friend of ours, she was in India and she met you actually. Maybe you remember her. Her name is Encina from Spain.
Oh, I know her, yes.
Yeah.
From Malaga? From Malaga?
Exactly, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And she asked us to tell you in which way you can intensify devotion, the attention to the self, in times when it doesn't seem to be available.
That's very hard. falling in love is the one thing you can't practice and you can't teach.
Yeah.
Some people are very, very fortunate in that they find an object of their devotion and that they become obsessed with it. They can't think of anything else. And if the object of their devotion happens to be an enlightened guru or a god, then that's a free ticket. They've got it made. To find someone in that state who you have absolute faith in and to love is a very rare conjunction, and it's very, very hard to manufacture that. You can say japa all day, you can sing your bhajans all day, you can increase your concentration, you can increase your focus on an object, but the one thing you can't increase is the love you have towards that object. That's either there or it isn't. Bhagavan once talked about japa, and he said japa done with the mind will increase your concentration, but if there's no love in there, then it could actually strengthen the mind, because you're just learning how to focus on an object with greater and greater intensity. You're not dissolving the mind, you're actually giving it exercises to strengthen it by holding on to a form, holding on to a name. But he said, to whatever extent you have love towards the name that you're chanting, to that extent the name will start dissolving your mind. So japa works if you have love towards the name that you're repeating. If you don't, it just makes the mind a bit stronger.
You cannot fake it.
All I'm saying is that love just seems to be something that some people have. You don't have to learn how to
you
fall
come
in love.
within. You just come within.
You see somebody, you fall in love. You don't have lessons on it, and you can't go to the store and buy anything to make it stronger.
Yeah.
If it's your lucky day, you fall in love with God or a guru, and that makes it very, very easy. Everybody else has to work on it through concentration.
Yeah.
And as I said, the concentration might be good. Holding on to a name or a form is good, but the dissolution of the mind depends on how much love you've got towards that form, not how strongly you concentrate on it.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about some habits. For example, when Ramana, I wanted to ask you when Ramana slept, when he was asleep, was he when he was in deep sleep, he was in some way conscious of consciousness itself being, or was it just like any other person? There was a difference between his deep sleep and any.
He would say that the states of waking, dreaming, and sleeping are transient appearances or transient manifestations of the mind, and that he didn't have a mind, therefore he didn't experience those states. He would say that his only abiding state was as self. He would concede that there was a body which sometimes appeared to be awake, sometimes appeared to be asleep. He said he also had dreams, but he wouldn't identify with that body, and he would never say, I am asleep. He would never admit that identification with the body or a mind that was in deep sleep. So that there is something about being in that state of self which is there all the time. So people occasionally come up to me and say, I'm enlightened. And I'm saying, are you aware of yourself at 3 o'clock in the morning when you're in deep sleep? And when you wake up in the morning, do you see a world in front of you? And if they say yes, they see a world in front of them when they wake up. And if they say no, they're not aware of self at 3 in the morning, then I conclude they're not in this state which transcends the 3 transient states of waking, dreaming, and sleeping. There's something about this state of underlying consciousness that is there all the time. It always knows itself as consciousness. There's no unconsciousness for this final state of consciousness. It always exists as it is. And the 3 states of waking, dreaming, and sleeping come and go on top of it without affecting it in any way. So on a more practical level, Bhagavan never really seemed to fall asleep in the way that we understand the
in the
state.
conventional way.
Kanji Swami has written that he never even lay down. He said nobody ever saw Bhagavan laying flat on a bed or on the floor. He said he would recline leaning backwards on his sofa, and he might have a pillow under his head, but he'd never go down flat. And there was never a time when you could be convinced that he was unconscious. Up until the early 1940s, you could walk into his hall, his private bedroom, at 3 o'clock in the morning with a problem, and he would open his eyes and start talking to you. He seemed to know that you were coming in. He didn't mind that you were coming in at 3 in the morning if it was something important. So there was no sense that he had to be woken up. There would be a knowledge in him that somebody had come. He would just open his eyes and start talking to you. People quizzed him about this, and he would say the eyelids have a muscle. He said you can't use a muscle all day without it getting tired. You can't walk 24 hours a day. You have to sit down occasionally. He said in the same way, the eyelids are controlled by a muscle, and if you keep them open for too long, it just gets tired. You have to close them to rest the muscle in your eyelids. So he said, don't assume that I'm asleep when my eyelids are closed. Yeah. And then Chadwick, for example, said, but Bhagavan, we hear you snoring. You close your eyes and we hear you snoring. And his response to that was, I know I snore, I enjoy it. If I didn't enjoy it, I wouldn't snore. So he seems to be in a state where he actually knows that his body is snoring.
It's just a body thing.
It doesn't bother him. It doesn't mean he's in deep sleep. It just means he's in a state where the body is resting, the muscles are resting. And if somebody comes in and wants to see him, he's there all the time. He's awake. So I talked to, Papaji used to get up in the morning, and he had a house full of foreigners at breakfast, and people would say, oh, morning, Papaji, how did you sleep? How did you sleep? And after a while, he just got annoyed. He said, stop asking me that question. I haven't slept for 60 years. Meaning, he said, when you're in this state, there's nobody who wakes up from sleep. There's nobody who goes into sleep. You're in that state all the time. Those states come and go in you. You're not in those states. So that's what Papaji was alluding to.
Yeah. Talking about enlightened people, you said when some devotees ask Ramana, can only a self-realized being recognize another one?
Yes. If you have a mind, then you have no capacity to recognize somebody who doesn't have a mind. If you don't have a mind, it's very clear, it's very simple. I talked to Lakshmana Swami about this, and he said it's so obvious. If your own mind is dead, he said you can be walking down the street, you can just glance across the street, and if there's a jnani on the other side of the road, he said a fraction of a second and you know it. You don't have to look at them, talk to them, study them, investigate them. There's an absolute irrefutable knowledge that you're in this state and that other person is in that state. But if you live in a world where you function through a mind, then you have no capacity to determine who is and who is not in that state.
Yeah, that's why sometimes we are misled to think that, oh, that teachers did that, he said that, he's not truly enlightened. You know, that the external manifestation can...
Bhagavan often said that you can't determine accurately who is and who is not enlightened by what they do or say. He didn't accept that there were any behavioral or doctrinal markers that set you out as enlightenment, as enlightened or not.
Yeah, just by looking at the cover, at the appearance. Yeah. Yeah. Let's see, we have some other questions here. Like, what about the another habit like food? Did Ramana ever say anything about food? What diet recommendations about?
He said sattvic food in moderate quantities. You understand what I mean by sattvic?
Yeah, well, can you explain again for people who might not know?
Sattvic would be in Western terms, fresh, uncooked, vegetarian food. Moderate quantities is self-explanatory. He said that's a good aid to doing inquiry efficiently. Also, he said moderation in sleep, moderation in diet, and eating sattvic food were good aids to inquiry. But the important thing is not what you eat, it's how much effort and determination you put into your practice. These are, in a way, minor ancillary aids that can help you do it a bit better, but they're not really a major part of the program.
Yeah, so he didn't. It's not that he prescribed them. Just it was gave a little help just to improve the practice.
The food served was always South Indian vegetarian. For cultural reasons, he wouldn't let anybody serve or eat meat in the ashram, but it was a very Rajasic diet. Rajasic diet would be food with onions, chilies, garlic, those kind of things. That they're supposed to excite the mind. But these were served on a regular basis at Ramana Ashram because in South India everybody enjoys them. That's what they want to eat. So he didn't bother to tell people they shouldn't be eating these. This is what people wanted. And on the whole, he went along with what people wanted.
What about
one interesting thing? It's accepted that hot chilies, peppers, all these things are rajasic and they activate the mind. So he was asked about this once, and interestingly, he said the mind of the person preparing the food determines whether the end product is sattvic or not. It's not the ingredients, it's how much love or mental quietude the cook has. So if, for example, at Ramana Ashram, Bhagavan used to get up at 2 or 3 every morning to chop vegetables. He was actively involved in the cooking and the preparation of the food. So you could say that everything served at Ramana Ashram had a very high sattvic quality because Bhagavan himself was in the kitchen chopping up the vegetables early in the morning. So in that case, the quietness of Bhagavan's state will be transmitted into the food. And if they were rajasic because they had lots of onions or chilies, it will be more than counteracted by the sattva that Bhagavan put into the making.
Yeah, so the cook has an important role too.
Right.
Yeah. What about the vasanas? I wanted to ask about the. Could you explain briefly what a vasana is? Better than me, maybe.
A vasana is a desire to do something, accomplish something. It's something that lies latent inside you, that has an emotional charge or an emotional intensity, such that when it arises inside you, it impels you or compels you to do something, to indulge in something, to have an experience.
Exactly. So, to what extent is it's necessary to be aware of unconscious behaviors or habits that we still value unconsciously, and that can prevent us from further progress?
No, that's not the way to do it, according to Bhagavan. What he is saying is that the vasanas have a certain emotional charge. Each time you indulge in something and enjoy it, then you add a charge of attractiveness to that particular desire, that particular vasana, such that this thing will jump up again and again and say, enjoy me, activate me, indulge in me. So each time that your mind has a sensation, I want to go to this mental place, indulge in this desire, it jumps up because in the past you've added emotional intensity to the desire or the enjoyment of the desire. So what Bhagavan is saying is that when you see these vasanas arise, don't suppress them, don't indulge them, be aware of what it is inside yourself that's experiencing the desire. He said every time that you withdraw from it, then the emotional intensity of that vasana is diminished. So they get more and more attenuated, they get quieter and quieter, and they lose their hold over you, they lose their capacity to drag you out into the world so that you get lost in the world. So he's saying that by not doing what they are trying to make you do, by being aware of who it is inside yourself that has this desire, you reduce and attenuate the desire to a level where they no longer have a power to distract you. But he said no amount of inquiry or detachment is going to eliminate these vasanas. He said that only will come through self-realization, through abiding in the self. He said you can reduce the intensity and the power that these vasanas have over you by constantly going back to thinking about or being aware of who it is that has the desires, but you're never going to eradicate them until this individual I gets absorbed back in the self and destroyed there.
So only total eradication of the I is the guarantee that the vasanas are going to be...
You can reduce and attenuate the vasanas by inquiry, by detachment, by watching, but they're always going to be in a dormant state until I itself is eradicated in the self. And what Bhagavan is saying is that the self ultimately is the executioner of the mind. It's the one that finally eliminates your sense of self, but it doesn't have the capacity to do this unless you yourself have reduced the power that the vasanas have over you. He said the self only has the capacity to pull into itself and extinguish a mind which no longer has any interest in extroverting itself. So your job, your function, is to do inquiry or surrender to the point where your mind no longer has any interest or passion in extroverting itself, at which point the self or God will reach out, pull you into itself and destroy you.
Yeah. So just to give an example, or to do it in a more practical way, let's say just that you're addicted to sugar, for example. You indulge in eating chocolates and candies, whatever. So if some moment the vasana comes, like it's the desire grows to eat chocolate or whatever, so you should refrain from indulging the action and just pause and self-inquire.
So Bhagavan is saying don't indulge and don't suppress. Those generally are the two alternate competing options, and he's saying neither of them is going to work. So he used to talk about yoga in a somewhat derogatory way. He said yoga specializes in suppressing thoughts, suppressing desires. He said that isn't going to work. If you sit on your desires, you're not causing them to go away or lessening them. You're just postponing them for a later moment when they'll break out again. He said the only effective way is to look at the process that causes you or compels you to reach out to consume something or to have a particular train of thought, to look at this thing I inside yourself that coordinates the desire which acts on that desire, and to whatever extent you can become aware of that process, be aware of that I inside yourself coordinating it, to that extent the desire will diminish.
And awakening and liberation, enlightenment, these are terms that we don't know if they refer to the same experience. Is there a prior experience, some awakening, temporary, constant state of being? Is there a difference between awakening, liberation?
It depends who you're talking to. All these, of course, are English words. That are translations of words in other traditions. Bhagavan talked about self-realization. That was his favorite word for final liberation. And for him, it was absolutely definitive. There was no going back. It wasn't something that you could lose. It was being aware of yourself as the underlying substratum, as the beingness, as the consciousness in which all other things appear and disappear. Once the individual I is eradicated in that state, there's no possibility of it ever arising again. But then it's possible for you to have glimpses mediated through a mind, mediated through an I. So in a sense that you are somehow dualistically getting a foretaste, a preview, if you like, of this final state. But so long as this I hasn't been definitively extinguished, it's always going to reassert itself.
Yeah. One question about the, let me check. So the because there are many people who nowadays communicate Advaita or Vedanta, non-duality, whatever, in Western countries too, and we get this sense that there is an increasing amount of people who communicate, who give say that there is no free will, there is no doer, no sense of doership, nothing exists, and things like that. You've probably heard of that. I don't want to go into that specifically, but it seems as if all these experiences, like liberation or enlightenment, they acquire different tastes, different tastes. We get different definition. Or,
okay.
And some people say that there is a final step and that's it, and there is no way back, as you said. And some people also say that it's a never-ending process, even though you acquire final liberation, self-realization. The alignment with that truth still continues for as long as you are alive, and there is an adjusting of that experience to the manifestation in your life. Do you think that's
totally disagree, and Bhagavan would totally disagree, and all the teachers I've been with would totally disagree.
Yeah.
There's a definitive moment of extinction of individuality, after which self alone remains. The body might continue, it might have a destiny to do something in the world, not to do something, but there's no further graduation of experiences, because the one who has the experiences has disappeared. You can only have experiences with an experiencer.
And so they would change if there was something that could tell that the experience would change. So there would be a witness there, or there would be some reminiscence of an eye that would see the change, right?
I'm not following the logic of that. Can you say again?
Yeah, that if somebody claims that there is a change or attenuation or more deepening of the experience of realization, that would mean that there would be still an eye or
yes,
still a witness, right?
You're having a reference point.
Yeah.
You're claiming about getting deeper, higher, more this, less that.
Yeah.
Then with that reference point, you're not in the state of jnana, you're not in the state of self. You're merely having evolving states of mind.
Yeah. Just for curiosity, if we picked up somebody on the street, just random person on the street, they would probably don't know who Ramana Maharshi or Nisargadatta Maharaj are. But do you think in 200, 300, 400 years from now, they will get the status that the Buddha or Jesus have? And 300, 400 years from now, Ramana Maharshi.
I'm not understanding this question. Can you explain again?
Yeah. Do you think if in the future, in 300 or 400 years from now, Ramana Maharshi and Nisargadatta Maharaj will be like the Buddha or Jesus today? They will be considered just like, and everybody will know about them.
I talked to Maharaj. I had a conversation with him and said, I read I Am That in Ramanashram, and I came here. It impressed me enough to come and see you. I find the words very, very powerful, and I can feel those words working on me. But I came here and you're alive, so it's possible that I'm conflating your presence with the power of your words in this book. So I said, as a hypothetical question, if somebody picks up I Am That in 10,000 years' time and reads it, will there still be power in those words? Will they still have the power to wake people up? And he said, yes. He said, time doesn't matter for the self. There's a power in those words. And if that person is ready, it doesn't matter whether it's tomorrow or 10,000 years, those words will do their work. And then he said that the words of jnanis survive because they have power in them. So he said 1,000 years ago, Adi Shankara was giving out Advaita teachings, and we still revere him today. We still read his words, and we still accept the truth of those words. He said there were probably other people, contemporaries of Shankara, who were saying exactly the same thing, but their words have not survived because they didn't have the power or the authority of coming from the experience of the self. So he said, if you have that experience of the self, then what you say is imbued with that power. That power can be in the spoken word that you listen to, it can be in the words that you read on a page, and it doesn't matter at what distance from the original source you read those words, there is a power in those words because the person who uttered them or wrote them was in that state, and they've put the power into those words, and those words will have the power to wake you up irrespective of how long ago they were written or said.
Yeah, so that's why probably the words had the power to take you from England to India, right?
Who knows? I'm here, and I'm not going to speculate on that.
Yeah.
But both Maharaj and Papaji, I talked to them both about this, and they said that when a jnani speaks, there is a power in his words which has the power to show you that state of jnana. They're not just giving you a piece of information, they are giving you a taste of that state. Because they themselves are in that state, their words are imbued with the power of that state. And when they say to you, you are consciousness, you are Brahman, they're not simply giving you a piece of information about yourself, they're actually activating the self, the consciousness, the Brahman in you, and causing you to experience it for yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but sometimes it seems like some things happen that are things that don't seem like coincidences. You know, like I like the story that you told about the 200 pounds that you were missing when you were in Israel, I think.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you needed for the trip to India while being in Israel, and you got the 3 days later, you got that lucky strike, you got the money, and many things like we've heard many things like that, you know, from many accounts of people who got the message they needed, they heard the right words at the correct time, and they were. I also heard the story of Maurice Friedman when he heard the train going to Tiruvannamalai, he just at the very right moment. Huh? There seems to be some magic or some influence, intangible influence.
If you have a strong desire for liberation, a strong desire for God, then that seems to bend the world in your favor. You meet the right people, the funds come for your pilgrimages, you pick up the right book at the right time. That there's something about having that desire that causes things to line up for you in a good way.
Yeah, that reminds me of Robert Adams, and how he used to see a man with a beard when he was a kid, not even a kid, or a baby, almost a baby, and how the chain of events that took him to India. And have you ever met him?
No, he was out of India years before I got there, and I never got a chance to go to America. He's one of the people I would have liked to have seen, but our paths never crossed.
Did you consider him to be a jnani, just like Ramana, or?
He convinced me in 1994, before Silence of the Heart came out. A manuscript copy of it arrived in Lucknow, and we went through it, and we all thought this is good stuff. And somebody showed it to Papaji, who I have to say was extremely scathing about all modern teachers. He had a universally low opinion of all of them. But he read a couple of chapters and he said, put this in the satsang bag for tomorrow. I like this man's teachings. I'm going to read this whole book out in satsang. And so for the next few weeks, he read the whole thing from cover to cover. And that was the only book by a living teacher that ever got that treatment. I think something resonated with Papaji. He liked the teachings. He must have connected with Robert State in some way and recognized he had the authority to say these things.
Yeah, and the also in the I saw the video in your about your biography. You said that when you read your first Ramana's book, that when you went back to university and you felt almost disgusted at the academic knowledge that filled the books, and do you still have that? I don't know, maybe not feeling of disgust, but maybe does modern science trigger your curiosity to know things of the external world?
I'm always curious about how the world works, interesting theories, new ideas on creation. I keep tabs on them, but not seriously enough to think of studying them full time.
Yeah. Let me see, we have covered many of the questions we had. And one question I missed before. You mentioned that early on when we were talking about the vasanas. To what extent is necessary a phase of in the main stages of the practice to go through a phase of isolation, or from people, objects, habits, the world, generally speaking?
Physical withdrawal from the world?
Yeah.
I think it's beneficial to a lot of people. I talked to Annamalai Swami, and he said, I was seeing Bhagavan every day. I was one of the lucky people who got private one-on-one time with him. I was working directly under his supervision. We had a lot of quality time together. And he was always telling me to work with the feeling, I am the self, I am Brahman, I am consciousness. But he kept me so busy on a job that required my mind to be active all the time. I could never be quiet. I could never experience that consciousness. But the moment he let me go and let me go off to meditate, then suddenly I got very, very quiet. So I thought that this is a man who was very mature, very devoted to Bhagavan. Even he couldn't attain that state of quietness through his work. He had to withdraw to a place nearby to do his meditation and get it. Yeah. There's quite a famous story that Bhagavan was sitting on his sofa, everybody was quiet, meditating, and Annamalai Swami walked into the hall, and Bhagavan immediately started talking about building business with him. And somebody complained and said, you know, can't you do that somewhere else? We're all sitting quietly here having a great meditation. And Bhagavan said his head is so full of building stuff that the moment he appears in front of me, I'm compelled to talk building stuff back to him. I mirror what's going on in the minds of the people around me. When Annamalai Swami walks in full of buildings, I have to talk buildings to him. So it wasn't even within Bhagavan's power to not talk buildings when Annamalai Swami was there, because that's what filled Annamalai Swami's head. So the moment Bhagavan said your karmas are finished, by karmas he meant activities, your actions. Your karmas are finished, your karmas are finished, your karmas are finished. Now you can go and meditate. He said the moment I sat down in Pelakatu, I got immediately very quiet. And the longer I stayed there, the quieter I got. So that was a very long roundabout way of saying that Bhagavan encouraged people to try to incorporate this in their daily life. But just about everybody I've come across, including really good devotees such as Annamalai Swami, found they couldn't do it, and that they did need a period of withdrawing and of isolation in order to get established.
I heard you say that that Ramana was also, he perceived the suffering that he saw in some other people, or I don't remember any specific stories now, but you mentioned something like when he saw suffering, somebody else's suffering, he could feel it, or when he felt the violence in somebody else, he could feel it. Is that true?
There's two ways of looking at that. That there was nothing in him that registered anything as other than himself.
Yeah.
He didn't recognize the existence of separation, other beings. He wouldn't even recognize that suffering existed from his final absolute state.
Mm.
He said once that if you think there are other people out there suffering who need your help, you have no business being a guru. He said in the state of jnana, you don't recognize anybody who needs any help. You know that all is the self and everything is functioning and proceeding in an orderly, preordained manner.
Yeah.
But he would also be aware of all the beings in his vicinity who didn't have that particular perspective, and he could physically, palpably feel their suffering, their distress, and not just physical, not just ordinary people around him. He could feel it in the animals, in the vegetation. So he knew if animals weren't being treated well. He knew if the trees were having a bad time. So he just had a kind of sense of other beings feeling not good. That's the best way of saying it. And it wasn't something that he witnessed by looking at people's faces. It was a more direct experience of all the things in his vicinity, in his neighborhood. He would know if the trees were happy. He would know if the animals are being fed or not.
Yeah.
And he once refused in the dining room a huge helping of food by saying, "You don't have to put food on my plate. I eat through everybody else's mouths." So he wasn't using that as an excuse. He genuinely did have the experience of being every single body in that dining room.
Mm-hmm.
And if 200 people were stuffing food into their mouths in that dining room, then his knowledge of himself would indicate that he was being fed. You didn't have to put food into one particular mouth, one particular body to have that feeling.
Yeah, amazing. I think, David, we got to the end of the conversation. We can put an end of the conversation here.
Okay.
I just can't thank you enough for giving us the opportunity to know some stories of the Ramana and the other teachers you've met.
Good. I enjoyed. I like talking about these people. I've had a good time.
We too. If you some other time you feel compelled to talk again with us, we're open.
Okay. So
thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Namaste.
Goodbye.
Namaste. Goodbye, David.